Hey, what's going on, everybody? Mr. Lutz here to talk to you guys about Unit 3A in our world history class, which is going to be on global interaction and transformation. So we're looking at about 1450 to 1750 in terms of a time period. We're going to be focusing on these three topics throughout the first half of Unit 3: Europeans in the Indian Ocean, the Columbian Exchange, and the Great Dyeing and the Slave Trade. Now, this video is just going to focus on Europeans in the Indian Ocean. So we're looking at motivations that prompt global exploration, and we're also looking at the effects of global exploration economically, socially, and politically. So some of the stuff that I'm going to cover here might be familiar to you from another class in the past. It might frankly be familiar to you in a reading you've already done for me or in some of the activities we've already done in class. So there's a good bit of notes in this presentation. I'll look to try to just hit some of the main points. You'll have the notes, then you can refer back to them as needed. So this first bit of information here should be review for you because this was our first lesson that we did in this unit, which was just asking the questions, why even are the Europeans trying to go out across the seas to seek these new trade routes? What was bad about the old ones? Why did they need to change in the first place? And really what I think that drives this motivation are two reasons predominantly. The first is going to be a desire for wealth. And that comes as a result of a renewed interest in what's going on in Africa, but especially in Asia, in terms of the availability of luxury goods that are out there that aren't necessarily found in Europe. And the Crusades is going to start to regenerate that interest to a large extent for wealthier Europeans, but supply in Europe is going to be low. So European merchants, predominantly when we're talking like the 11 or the 1200s especially, the European merchants are going to mostly be Italians who were sailing into the Mediterranean, getting into the eastern end of it, and overland trading from there, trying to secure spices and other luxury goods that Europeans really want their hands on. That is going to start changing, though, as people further west in Europe start resenting kind of being cut out of that trade. There's also a desire to spread Christianity around the world, and that also comes as a result of the Crusades as well. Islam has been this religion that is spreading throughout Afro-Eurasia at a quicker rate than Christianity had been up until that point in time. So many Christians are thinking, if we want to ensure that our religion is the predominant world religion, then there needs to be a plan put in place to make sure Christianity is going to be spread. And there's a belief among many Christians as well that if you don't convert people to Christianity, they're going to have an afterlife that isn't the most desirable. So they believe it's their mission to convert these people so that they don't face those negative consequences in the afterlife. Aside from why are Europeans getting these new trade routes, or why do they want these new trade routes, there is some technology that does make it possible. You have caravel ships, which are able to withstand longer journeys. They're able to withstand rougher seas. The astrolabe and the compass are going to be helping in terms of navigation and making those journeys in open waters away from a coastline, making those far more possible. So it's going to be Portugal that is going to get Europe into the Indian Ocean trade network. And it starts really with Prince Henry the Navigator. He has a desire for foreign goods, and it kind of starts with some excursions into North Africa, but he wants to push Portuguese exploration further and further along the African coast. So a lot of Portuguese sailors are going to be sailing along the western coast of Africa, and they're going to start trading for things that are going to become very prevalent during this time period, particularly gold and slaves as well on the West African coast. But there starts to emerge a new belief that the coast of Africa can be rounded at its southern tip, and from there you can enter into the Indian Ocean and move into Asia. So the first who's going to be able to round the southern tip of Africa is going to be Bartolomeo Diaz, who's going to do it in 1488. He hits a lot of rough storms around the southern tip of Africa, but finally gets around it, gets into the new ocean, sails back to Portugal, talking of his discoveries and what he found. That process continues on for another 10 years before Vasco da Gama not only sails around the southern tip of Africa, but makes it all the way out to India in 1498. So while that's going on, excuse me while I move my face out of the way a little bit here, blocking some of the text for you guys. Maybe not. Maybe I'll shrink it. There we go. All right. There we go. Christopher Columbus, for the Spanish, is going to be thinking there's got to be a better way. There's got to be a more efficient way to get to Asia. And he has the bright idea that he can get to Asia by sailing west into the open waters of the Atlantic Ocean, where he can find a route to the Indies, the Spice Islands, now Southeast Asia, and India. So he's going to be basically pleading with King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain several times, hoping that he can secure the funding in order to go on these voyages. And he's going to get the funding eventually, and he is going to make it across the Atlantic, and he is going to hit land. He thinks it's Asia, but it turns out to be the Caribbean. So he gets into what are now called the West Indies, because everyone wanted to be polite to Columbus, I suppose, and tell him he found the Indies, though it was not the Indies he thought he had found it. But we'll talk about this later on. Columbus ends up starting a process where Europeans are interacting with what they deem to be a new world and exchanging all sorts of goods, resources, ideas, disease, problems. We'll talk later more about that. But it begins this process known as the Columbian Exchange, which we'll revisit. So Columbus thinks he's in Asia. He's not, but he thinks he is. And the Portuguese think that he's in Asia as well, but he's not. But they do get upset by this. They're concerned about this development. And the world kind of knows that there's mounting tensions between the Portuguese and the Spanish. So the Pope of the Catholic Church, Alexander VI, tries to help this tension by creating basically a division with a north-south line that basically splits through the Atlantic Ocean and says that everything that is to the east of this line can go to the Portuguese, and everything that is to the west of this line can go to the Spanish. Now, it gets adjusted a little bit, and this becomes known as the Treaty of Tordesillas, which basically gives Spain everything in South America except for Brazil, and everything to the Portuguese, basically in the Indian Ocean area. But the Spanish will get the Philippines, which we'll talk about later on. So here's your competition in the Indian Ocean. It's really the Portuguese who take the first swing. It's a bad word choice. They take control for European trade in the Indian Ocean first, and they're going to have trading posts all throughout the region, in India, Persian Gulf, the Arabian Sea, and the Straits of Malacca. And they'll have that by 1511. Now, Spain is going to enter the region. That's going to come when you have Ferdinand Magellan make his circumnavigation of the world. And he's going to make it to the Philippines. He's going to die before he gets all the way back to Spain, though some of his crew will make it back to Spain. But the Spanish are going to seek to take control of the Philippines. Now, later on, as the Portuguese, being a relatively small nation, are not able to hold on to control of the Indian Ocean, and the Dutch, or the Netherlands, and the English are going to start to chip away at Portuguese control of the Indian Ocean trade network. Both the Dutch and the British are going to form their own East India companies, and they're going to start to create trade posts throughout the region. The Dutch will typically leave it at the trade post level for the most part, but the British will look to build more of an empire over time. And you will see the French start to make a presence in the region as well, a little bit after these two nations. So that's kind of setting the stage for you, talking about Europeans getting out beyond the waters and the territories that they're familiar with. So they've got a presence across the Atlantic, they've got a presence in the Indian Ocean, and they've got a presence in the Pacific, where you've had the established civilizations of the Chinese and Japanese existing for a very long time now. So the question now moves for us to what you see on the slide. How do the Chinese interact with Europeans when they make this first contact? China at first is going to look to control and restrict the flow of trade. And this has been managed by the government during this time. But there is a black market that does exist out of the two cities, Canton and Macau, where trade has typically been restricted to. There is more trade going on there than the government would really like. Why Europeans are there? It's really the same reasons why foreigners have been wanting to trade with the Chinese for centuries now. It's the luxury goods that are there. The silks, porcelain. So when we say porcelain, we mean like fine china. Uh, Tea as well will start to become popular in a little bit. By the end of this time period, it will be for sure. Um, but the Chinese don't really prioritize trade. They don't really think it has too much value for their society. Um, so they really make foreign merchants kind of do some, I guess, embarrassing things in order to get trade. One thing they'll make them do is they'll make them kowtow, which means they'll bow low, get down on their hands and knees, make their head touch the floor, humbly accept their inferiority to the Chinese, and they have to pay tribute to the Chinese emperor, meaning they have to present gifts if they want to engage in trade, which people want to trade with China more than China wants to trade with the rest of the world. So China tells the rest of the world, well, then tell us we're better than you and come on over and trade. That's cool. But also, too, the Chinese are limiting the spread of Christianity. The European missionaries have tried to come into the Chinese court to try to show off all these new European inventions. And they intrigue the emperor, they intrigue the emperor's court, but that doesn't really mean that they're all of a sudden going to jump on board with Christianity. So the question becomes, well, why? Why are the Chinese acting this way towards Europeans? And I guess part of that answer comes back to the explorer Zheng He, who was a Chinese admiral from the early 1400s. So we're talking almost 100 years prior to the Europeans making it into the Chinese coastal port cities. Now, Zheng He sails in these massive ships. You can't really see it in the image in the background here, but if you see that there's these big yellow sails, that's the size of Zheng He's ship. And then you see right where my mouse is, these three tiny little sails, and you can Google this image as well. That's the size of one of Columbus's ships, these orange sails right here, in relation to the Chinese ships. Massive ships, tens of thousands of men going into the Indian Ocean on behalf of China to trade. And really what China's coming back with are like exotic animals, giraffes. I don't know. That's what they're doing. It's their life. It's their journey. I respect that. But they're returning with diplomats as well. What they're really concluding is there's not much of value out there for the Chinese. And Confucianism as a philosophy kind of rejects the position of merchants in society. Because if you think about it, the whole thing with Confucianism is you're supposed to provide for one another and do things that mutually benefit one another in Confucian society. And they look at merchants and they're like, you just do stuff to benefit yourself. You buy something from one person and you get it at a low cost. You raise the price of that good and then you pass that good on to someone else and you profit from that. And they don't really respect that. But yeah, Chinese attitudes, they're seeing things out there in the world and they're like, you're just ripping off of stuff from the Chinese. Case in point, you see this quote from the Emperor Kangxi where he says, the principles of mathematics all derived from the Book of Changes, and the Western methods are Chinese in origin. This algebra springs from an Eastern word. So even the stuff that they're seeing out there, they're like, yeah, that's impressive. They're kind of like, you're just ripping us off anyway. We don't like it. So there's definitely an attitude of superiority with the Chinese that leads to this limited interaction with Europeans. Now for the Japanese, they reject expansion as well. The Portuguese make landfall in Japan as of about 1543, and the lords of Japan, the samurai lords, these are known as the daimyo, these are like your regional power brokers. They really want to trade with European merchants because European merchants have gunpowder weapons, which for them they're like, yes, because those gunpowder weapons can give them an advantage over other daimyo lords who they might have a rivalry with. Because Japan at this time, folks, not so unified. And they're intrigued by other goods as well. But then missionaries arrive, about 1549. And at first, the Japanese were like, okay, you're bringing some cool stuff. You guys can come on in, tell us about your religion. That's fine. But by 1587, and we've seen this in class, the Japanese start to restrict Christianity and they start to outlaw European missionaries from spreading their faith there. And by 1612, Christianity is outlawed. By 1637, Christians are starting to be hunted down and are being forced to demonstrate their loyalty to Buddhism. By 1639, the Japanese have shut themselves off pretty much totally from foreign contact. Japanese people cannot sail overseas. If they are overseas, they're not permitted back. And all Europeans, except for the Dutch, are forbidden to enter Japan. Portuguese sailors try to get into Japan. They're like, oh, this law doesn't apply to us. Who cares? We're going to do it anyway. And their ship is set fire to. Every single sailor, except for one, is killed. And that sailor is told to go back to Portugal and tell people what happened. Chinese merchants can also trade with the Japanese as well. Now, the question is, why did this just happen? Why are the Japanese at first intrigued, especially by gunpowder weapons, but really hostile and skeptical of Christianity? So you have to understand, from 1467 to 1568, you have basically this warring states period where these samurai lords, these daimyo, all over Japan are in a feudal system where the emperor doesn't really have much power. The power is with the daimyo. And those daimyo, the stronger daimyo, fight one another for more power and more authority. Now, you do have some leaders start to emerge, guys like Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. Those three are going to be shoguns. They are going to be the military rulers of Japan, and they're going to consolidate more and more control over the country. You're going to get to where Tokugawa Ieyasu takes full control of Japan. He is the guy in charge. Daimyo no longer has power. So now he has to decide, well, what do I do with these Europeans? They could be a threat to my power. So the daimyo are going to stay in their positions of power on the local level, but Tokugawa forces the daimyo, you have to travel to the capital city, to Tokyo, every other year, where you are basically going to be my hostage. So if you're plotting against me, good luck doing it, because every other year I make you leave your home where your power base is. And so that really stabilizes the country. So now the question is, well, Europeans are bringing in these weapons. Who's that helping? And it was the daimyo. So Tokugawa Ieyasu is going to start to say, well, maybe we don't need these goods from you anymore. But the bigger problem comes with the Christians, because the Christians are teaching of this all-powerful God. The shogun starts getting in his head, who are Christians going to be more loyal to? Their God or me as the shogun? And so the solution to avoiding that dilemma, get rid of Christianity. Then there won't be any kind of a dilemma whether you should be loyal to the shogun or God. So they're going to ban Christianity. And when you have stability in this country and Christianity is on the way out, trade can start to flourish inside of Japan. So then they start to say, well, economically, we don't really need Europeans as well. So then they're going to restrict European trade too, heavily. So that's where we're going to leave it for now. Now, our next topic we'll talk about is going to be the Columbian Exchange, but that's going to be for a later date. So for now, leave it there, and I will see you guys in class. Till then, take care, everybody.